This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. Today I am very happy to have two gentlemen with us, Clifford Sondock and Paul Graziano, and they are going to talk about land use. First, I want to give some background information about both Mr. Sondock and Mr. Graziano. Paul has founded numerous homeowners organizations. Among them are the Auburndale Improvement Association, the Bayside Gables Homeowners Association, and I can go on and on. He's surveyed and co-designed the contextual rezoning plans for Bayside, College Point, Douglaston, and many other places. The aim was to protect these neighborhoods from overdevelopment. Now I'm going to skip in his history to 2021. Paul was the leader in stopping Council Speaker Corey Johnson from eliminating one-family neighborhoods citywide and forcing Northeast Queens to build more high-rise density every 10 years forever. Clifford Sondock is the president of the Land Use Institute, a Long Island-based land use think tank which studies public policy on land use issues. He has spent 45 years in real estate, development, investment, leasing, and management. He is a long-time sponsor and member of the Cato Institute, which is a free market libertarian think tank, the Mercatus Center, which is an economic and political science department of the George Mason University, and the Institute for Justice. Now, Cliff serves on the Long Island Real Estate Group in Mineola, New York. Most important to remember is that Clifford is a passionate proponent of free markets.
Thank you, Sandra.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Paul, nice to meet you.
Pleasure.
Let me just start by saying that yes, the Land Use Institute is an ardent supporter of free markets and trying to maintain a prosperous and peaceful community and society. And real estate actually plays a very, very important role in our lives. If you take a look, for example, at the cost of living and the cost of doing business, the cost of living index is a weighted average. And the cost of housing, for example, represents 35% of the cost of living index, which means that if you have high cost of housing, it raises your cost of living. For companies, aside from their cost of real estate and their cost of maybe production, producing goods and services, is salaries, cost of for salaries. The biggest component for people who work for salaries is their cost of living, is housing. So what I advocate for is trying to create a situation where you have a very fluid, plentiful source of housing, great selection, great quality, at a great price. And I would concede, I would.
How do you get there?
Well, I think the first thing you want to do is you want to let the market determine what the people in the community want. And in most cases, the developers and builders will build that. Most adversaries of that idea are trying to maintain the status quo and usually stopping projects. Mm-hmm. And really, zoning is a thing that's now ubiquitous, that is something that occurred over the last 100 years, and it's gotten more and more restrictive. And so restrictive zoning prevents the market from naturally producing the housing and real estate that people want and need, and companies as well. And I would assume Paul has well, Paul, I'll let you respond to that. What do you think?
Well, I wanted to let you continue speaking as much as you're...
I'm fine. I'm just advocating. I know a little bit about this, Mayor Adams' intent to make things, the zoning and the restrictions, reduce them in New York City. And I would, if that's what the policy is, I would be a big advocate of that. I think lowering the restrictions and reducing them is very beneficial.
Do you want to give some examples?
Yes, I can give you an example. And again, our institute deals with communities all over the country. And so I won't just pick on New York, but I'll take San Francisco, for example, the Bay Area. In order to, and their intent was actually to keep the cost of housing lower. And what did they do? They set mandates. They required that a certain, and this is the same in New York City, where a certain percentage, maybe 10–20% of new housing units in an apartment building is reserved for lower income housing, and they constrain the price. They require the prices be lower. And what happens is it impedes upon the development, which sometimes no project is built. It's not affordable, so they don't build it. And so by having housing mandates with the intention of keeping prices lower, it has the opposite effect.
Yes, I was wondering how you manage to have something that's affordable to the general population of the area, and also meets the developers' desires.
So sometimes when I try to explain it, creating an affordable home is the same way you would create an affordable car. You could have a car, a BMW, that the price of it's $5,000. The way that happens is by producing new BMWs. The older BMWs are sold as used cars. So the way to lower the cost of housing and maintain value is by allowing developers to build what the market wants. You increase supply and the price goes down. If you constrain supply, the price stays elevated. On top of it, you reduce the value. Value in terms of economic value. Value is where you have something that is that's plentiful, high quality at a lower price.
You were using the example of a car, so it makes me curious. When you can sell a high-priced car, but you also have a secondary market for the used, same type thing. How does that work in housing?
It's really simple. So in housing, when we talk about housing and the price of housing, we usually talk about it in the terms of 12 months of a year. So in the course of a year, okay, there's so many housing transactions that occur. For every brand new home that's market priced, okay, you have a multiplier effect of about 2.5 units. So if I build a new home that's market priced, that is bought by somebody who wants it, there are 2.5 transactions that take place over 12 months. For example, let's say that you have a house, you've been living in it for 30 years, it's a 4-bedroom home, and you want to downsize. You put your home on the market, okay? Somebody who is buying up from an apartment, say, or townhouse, buys your house. They put their house on the market. A brand new housing, new family wants to buy a new starter home and buys that house. So by selling one market rate house, there's 2.5 transactions.
What happens when there's we say a taking, or an area is shall we say developed? It's old housing, but it's being used to construct new buildings.
Right.
How does that work with the example that you're doing?
Well, you're talking about gentrification, where,
yes,
and
right.
This is common throughout New York City. So yeah, typically in New York or many urban area, you would buy a 2 or 3 or 4-story older building, and you would knock it down and you build a 30-story brand new glass apartment building. Correct? Okay. So you're trading in 40 units for 280 units. Okay. You increase the supply of housing; those units are purchased, and so you increase from 40 units to 280 units. Increase the supply of housing.
And what happens with the people that were there? They buy a new house.
They would move to another place wherever they want to go. Often, if this is a brand new apartment building or a condo, it might be more expensive. And these people would have to either they would sell their units, okay, if they own them themselves. Most likely it's a co-op or a condo. If it's a co-op or an apartment building, probably an apartment building, then they have to rent someplace else.
So I'm gonna thank you, Clifford. So a lot of what you just heard here is theory. It's economics and very logical in the sense that for a free market libertarian, like my colleague to the left of me, it makes perfect sense to him. But for the reality of the people who live in New York City, this is exactly the wrong way to do things. Now, why is it the wrong way to do things? So we have a city. Let's throw out some statistics here, because before we even get into the city of Yes, which is an apocalyptic program by this mayor, the indicted mayor, who is doing this for his friends in the real estate industry who wrote this plan, not the community. Apocalyptic. Mm-hmm. Yes, extinction level event for communities around the city. Let's throw some statistics out first. We have lost over 800,000 people in the city of New York in the last 6 years. We are actually at a population under 8 million for the first time in over 30 years. That's the same population that we had in 1960, same population. We have 800,000 units more of housing than we did in 1960. So this is not a supply issue. We do not have a problem with supply in New York City. We have an affordability problem. And the only way you can create an affordability solution is through state and federal and city mandates, because the market will not correct itself. Why won't it correct itself? Well, right now we have over 300,000 vacant units. Now there's a big I don't want to say a fantasy, but a often quoted number from this administration of why we need to do the city of Yes. They state we have a 1.4% vacancy rate in the city of New York. But that's 1.4% of the units that are being for rent. There are over 320,000 vacant units in the city that landlords are not renting. They are holding them back. Some of them are holding them back because there's been a change in the tenant laws at the state level, and I'm not taking the landlord or tenant side here, it's just a fact. So some are shy on doing this. Some, especially large landlords, are actually holding back these units to increase the rent, specifically throughout the city, because again, the goal is to create profits for the landlords, not to supply housing for people who need it. And in addition, anybody who is in this situation where they can keep their units off the market can take a capital gains loss on their taxes. So in essence, they're not a capital gains loss, correct. So they're essentially able to write off the fact that they haven't rented their units. Okay, so we have all of this capacity in the city. Now, 20 plus years ago, the government decided to create a ceiling on what we call rent-stabilized units. Rent-stabilized units only allowed a certain increase based upon that they could, minimal amounts that they could do per year. And when they created this ceiling, which I believe at the time was $1,700 a month, which at the time, 25 years ago, was a very high number, and today, obviously, is an extremely low number, well, over 500,000 units were decontrolled. And once that happened, they went to market rate rental levels at 5,000, 6,000, 4,000, whatever that number is. So the idea that the market can solve this is laughable in New York City, number one. And number two, again,
it's laughable
because it hasn't happened. And again, we have capacity, right? The capacity is there. And it is not being used because either, quote unquote, the free market isn't operating the way the free market is supposed to operate, which is to say that those units are not available because the landlords are holding them back. Or, for example, in the case of other units, we have tens of thousands of units that have been built in the city in the last 10 years. You've heard of Billionaires Row? Take a look at those buildings. Some of those buildings are 60, 70, 80% vacant. Why? Because people are buying those units to park their money here from international buyers, because their own countries that they're from are less stable than our country. So they are investing here, dropping their investments here, and parking their money here in a safe haven situation. Because if they have that money in their own country, there's a chance that if they make the government angry at some point, they may disappear and their financial situation may disappear as well. So again, I live in Flushing. Downtown Flushing has had tens of thousands of units built in the last 20 years. Huge numbers of units. There are buildings that are more than 50% vacant. They're being purchased as chips from overseas. And again, Billionaires Row, many other units around the city. So we have, again, the free market is dictating rentals? No. The free market is dictating the ability for developers to make a ton of money and for the very, very wealthy to be able to purchase these units and hold them for themselves. So,
and also tax, you say capital.
Right. And again, those who, well, again.
I'm not sure it's capital gains, I think it's income. You have an expense against income, not capital gains, but income.
Oh, okay.
Can I respond?
Sure.
Okay,
Go
so listen, Paul, you bring up a lot of good arguments that I've heard many, many times. Let's take, and there's several of them you brought up. One is all the empty apartments that are standing fallow because they're not being renovated and leased out. Let's start before that. Let's talk. You kind of denigratingly talk about the free market. Let me just say this: the free market is nothing more than individuals doing voluntary exchange. They're not being forced to interact with each other, and property rights. I own an apartment. You're a tenant. You want to use my apartment. You pay me rent, and I'll let you use my apartment. And it's voluntary. Both of us, it's voluntary. So the free market isn't perfect. As a matter of fact, I would describe the free market like when you're driving your car, and you have your hand on the steering wheel. If you took your hand off the steering wheel, the wheel would move. When you have your hand on the steering wheel, you're driving straight, you're constantly, unconsciously turning it left and right. You're correcting your mistakes constantly. The free market is as a system is constantly correcting mistakes. Sometimes it does it well, sometimes it doesn't. Okay? It's not perfect. There's no utopia. But I would contend that the problem with all these empty buildings and all these apartments is that the government is constraining the price that the owners can rent their apartments out, and it's so bad that it's more advantageous for them to leave them vacant than to get rent, because the rent is not enough to cover the expense to renovate them. If you got rid of, I'm a big advocate of getting rid of both the rent stabilization and rent control in New York City. I think rent stabilization actually unintentionally has a consequence of causing less development and more units off the market, just like you suggested, just like you pointed out.
So the first thing I'm gonna say is all markets are regulated. There is no such thing as the free market. And depending on how government puts its thumb on the market in question determines the outcome, right, to some degree. Now, you keep talking about a car. You keep talking about free exchange of goods and services. If the government had not forced car makers to put seatbelts in their cars, they wouldn't have done it. Well, if the government had not forced building owners to put in safety features, they wouldn't do it. So to hear you talk about, again, you say it's not a utopia, but the way you started your description about it, it sounds very much like a utopia.
Let me give
and I'd like to speak, please. We're in reality.
Right.
Reality is we have a city, a very complicated city, and a very complex city that is both benefited and burdened by land use. But we have a number of different pieces in motion that have been exacerbated. Again, those who are landlords, their ultimate job is to make money. Those who are renters are trying to find a place to live. It's a very uneven and unequal relationship. Now, again, I don't say that the government has great ideas all the time. That's very clear. And some of the decisions they've made are insane in terms of the tenant owner-renter relationship. But that being said, when you have a situation where you wipe out regulations in one fell swoop, which happened with deregulation, it's happening now with the City of Yes, which we will go into, what's being proposed. The outcomes of these things, you talk about the unintended consequences of rent stabilization. I talk about the unintended consequences of removing rent stabilization. And the reason rent stabilization was put in there in the first place was for the exact problem of overreach by, quote unquote, the free market and the massive amounts of power that the development community has in New York City.
There's no power that a developer doesn't have any power. Okay?
Developer has tons of power.
No. What I mean by that, Paul, is that power is force. You said you made a comment that there's no such thing as a free market, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So there are some markets that are more free than others, though, right?
That's true.
Okay. I mentioned at onset, I'm from Houston, Texas. I assume that you're aware.
I'm very familiar with Houston. And we are not Houston in New York City.
No. The point I'm making is that so Houston, one of the unique aspects of Houston, I was going to say qualities, but aspects of Houston, is it's the only major metropolitan area probably in the United States that has no zoning. No zoning. Houston is probably the worst geography in the United States. It's 60 miles inland. It has no redeeming body of water but smelly bayous. It's flat. It has inheritable soil, and the worst climate probably in the United States. It has no strategic location. But somehow in the 1970s, before we started, we talked about how we both were in Houston in the 70s. The population of Houston was about 500,000 people. Okay? 50 years later, there's almost 7 million people in Houston.
In the Houston metropolitan area.
Correct, the SMSA,
Thank
correct.
you.
You're right, yes.
Yes.
The Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk County, back in the 1970s had about 2 million people. Today there's about 2.8 million. Mm-hmm. So Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk County has increased population about 1% a year on average, and Houston is probably 15% a year. So people are voting with their feet to go to a place that is not even close to as nice in terms of geography as New York. And the reason they're going there, I would contend, Paul, is because people go towards value, okay? A supply and quality at a lower price. I would contend that if you relax the zoning in New York City, in the state of New York, I'm not saying a pure free market, but if you made it more free, what you would find is the market would produce more housing that people wanted, and people would find a better place to live at a lower price. Okay, by restricting and causing rent control, you take units off the market. You gave the example, which lowers the supply of the available housing stock. Even though you had these units sitting fallow, you made the example, and I think I'm using your argument to support my point. You're causing a disincentive for people to put these units on the market, and you're lowering the supply, which raises the price.
Well, again, who's to say that if another 500,000 units are built, those units, A, are going to be available for renters, and B, that they're not going to keep them off the market because the government is continuing to have the same rules, and therefore they...
Bingo.
Well,
bingo.
But
again,
if
the government changes
I don't
the rules,
agree with your rules that you want to change. I'm saying that because of the unequal relationship between developers and owners and tenants, which has always been unequal, this is nothing new, because of the...
What do you mean unequal? I don't understand what you mean unequal.
When you're a landlord,
right,
you're the owner. You have a tenant. Your tenant is a renter of your property. You have more rights, and developers and owners have always had more rights than tenants do. And the changes that have been done to the state laws, changing that, some of that has been good in my opinion, but some of it may not be good. I'm not saying that all of it has been good at all. As I said, I'm taking a base neutral approach, but I'm very familiar with the unequal relationship between, it's like being a supplicant and a king. Okay, I'm just being ridiculous by saying that, but I'm saying there is an unequal situation, and let's go a step further. Hold on, wait. I would like to finish my statement. Thank you. When you have a developer, and you have large landlords like the Rent Stabilization outfit, Rent Stabilization Association, and REBNY, the Real Estate Board of New York, these are the largest groups of landlords and developers in the city. They have an unparalleled amount of money to help get the people that they want elected into office, period. And the tenants and the homeowners, and what I mean by homeowners, I mean owner-occupiers they own their own home, but they're not renting out their units. They're not developing property. They're just the American dream people, right, who make up the vast majority of places like Nassau and Suffolk County, or who make up places in Queens or in Staten Island or Brooklyn or the Bronx or even in Manhattan. Are you a co-op owner?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
So you live the American dream because you're a owner-occupier in your co-op.
The reason I'm the American dream is because I've worked very hard.
Okay.
But Paul, we're getting off topic.
We're not off topic.
Look, I'd like you to talk for a while. Let me just make a point to address what you've said, okay?
Sure.
A landlord or the property owner has an equal footing with the tenant if it's a freer market, and I'll tell you why. If you don't have the restraints on building and you have enough units, what happens is that the tenant becomes equal power with the landlord, because the landlord has to rent the space.
Or not.
Well, if he doesn't rent the space,
then he takes a break on his taxes.
No,
Absolutely.
Paul, I can tell you, the object for any landlord is not to leave their space vacant. That is absurd. Listen, if you want to take that as a premise, I can't argue. The premise is false. It's a false premise.
I disagree with you.
Okay,
Totally.
well then, let's put that aside. Let's assume for a moment that if you have a space and you have a unit that's vacant, you want to lease it. Okay, you want the best tenant, and if there's enough units that are vacant, the tenants have an advantage. The tenant is king.
There are enough units that are vacant.
Now, I want to thank you both very much for giving us a good show. And this is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Until the next time, have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.